When he realized the will wasn't just his, something inside him snapped. It happened in my kitchen, not in a lawyer's office. There were no strangers present, no official voices, no warnings, just the two of us, a mother and her son, and a truth that could no longer stay hidden. The morning light crept in through the window above the sink, pale and cold, touching the edges of the table but never quite warming the room. Breakfast sat untouched. The coffee had already cooled. I was seated at the table, my hands resting calmly in front of me, folded the way they always were when I didn't intend to explain myself. The papers lay there between us, not pushed toward him, not hidden from him, just placed neatly, deliberately, as if they had every right to exist. My son stood across the table, flipping through the documents with the confidence of someone who believed the ending was already decided. His movements were casual, almost bored. He scanned the pages quickly, barely reading, the way people do when they think they already know what the words will say. At first there was nothing, no reaction, no concern. Then his fingers slowed. I noticed the change before he did. His eyes stopped moving so quickly. His brows drew together, just slightly. He leaned closer, rereading a paragraph he hadn't expected to need to reread. The room seemed to shrink around us, as if the walls themselves were listening. He cleared his throat. "This is strange," he said, half to himself. I didn't respond. He turned the page again, and again, this time more carefully. His breathing grew louder, less controlled. The confidence he'd walked in with began to leak out of him in small, invisible cracks. "Why is it written like this?" he asked, tapping the page. I kept my eyes on him, but my face gave him nothing. No reassurance, no apology, no explanation. The silence settled in, heavy and deliberate. He laughed once, a short, brittle sound that didn't belong in that quiet kitchen. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "It says the will is divided." That was the word. Divided. I watched it land on him slowly, the way bad news always does when the mind tries to reject it first. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched. He went back to the first page, then the last, as if the truth might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough. "Where's the part that says it's all mine?" he asked. Still, I said nothing, and that was when his face changed. Not anger yet, not rage, confusion, pure, unguarded confusion, the kind that comes when a belief you've held for years suddenly collapses without warning. He looked up at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. "You're joking," he said. "This isn't final, right?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. That small movement seemed to unnerve him more than words ever could. He pushed the papers back toward me, harder this time. The chair scraped against the floor as he shifted his weight, irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. "So who else did you give it to?" he demanded. Not why, not when, not did something happen. Just that. Ownership. Entitlement. I met his eyes and held his gaze. There was no anger in me, no triumph, just a calm that came from knowing I had already done what needed to be done. The silence stretched again. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet. It wasn't confusion. It was restraint. I had learned over many years that some truths are too solid to argue over. They don't need defending. They don't need raising your voice. They simply exist. And once revealed, they change everything. I watched the realization sink in, piece by piece. He wasn't the only heir. He never had been, not in the way he believed. The house, the money, the life he spoke about as if it were guaranteed, none of it belonged to him yet. Something inside him shifted. I could see it. The moment control slipped from his grasp. And sitting there in the cold light of that early morning, I knew this wasn't just about a will. It was about power. And power, once questioned, never disappears quietly. Everything I built for him. Before there were wills, documents, or silence at the breakfast table, there was only a small house and a young woman learning how to survive. I became a widow at 42. One day I was a wife with plans, and the next I was standing in a funeral home, holding my son's hand so tightly my fingers ached, wondering how I was supposed to raise a boy alone when I could barely breathe myself. My husband was gone suddenly. No warning, no long goodbye, just a phone call and a life split cleanly in two. From that moment on, everything I did became about one thing: my son. The house we lived in wasn't much. An old American home with creaking floors, a wooden porch that groaned under your feet, and a giant oak tree out front that dropped leaves everywhere in the fall. But to me, it wasn't just a house. It was shelter, stability, a promise I made to myself that no matter what, my child would have a place that didn't change, even when everything else had. I worked more jobs than I can count. Mornings at a diner before sunrise, afternoons cleaning offices downtown, evenings sewing hems and repairing dresses for women in the neighborhood who paid me in cash and sometimes in kindness. There were nights I came home so tired I sat in the car for a few minutes just to gather the strength to walk inside. But I never complained. Not once. Because every bill I paid, every grocery bag I carried, every repair I put off was for him. So he could have school supplies, so he could have decent clothes, so he could grow up without feeling like life had already decided against him. That house became the center of everything. Every nail I hammered in myself, every coat of paint I applied slowly over weekends, every broken appliance I learned to fix instead of replacing. It wasn't pride, it was necessity. I couldn't afford to fail. And my son grew up watching all of it. He watched me stretch $1 until it begged for mercy, watched me smile through exhaustion, watched me say, "I'm fine," even when my back ached and my hands were raw from work. I thought he was learning resilience, gratitude, respect. I believed that sacrifice was visible, that children see what you give up for them. On the shelf in the living room, I kept old photographs. Him as a toddler on that very porch, missing 2 front teeth and grinning like the world belonged to him. School photos, graduation day, every milestone carefully placed in frames I dusted weekly. Those photos reminded me why I kept going. The house wasn't an investment to me. It was proof. Proof that even after loss, I had built something solid, something that lasted, something he could always come back to. When people asked why I never downsized, never sold and moved somewhere smaller, I always gave the same answer. "This is his home," I'd say. "He grew up here." Even after he became an adult, even after he moved back in temporarily, I never questioned it. In my mind, the house was part of my love, a continuation of motherhood, a safety net I had woven with my own hands over decades. I trusted that love was enough, that everything I had built, every wall, every memory, every sacrifice, was understood. I didn't know yet that love, when mixed with entitlement, can slowly turn invisible. As my son grew older, my life quietly reorganized itself around his future. I didn't plan trips. I didn't dream about retirement. I didn't ask myself what I wanted next. Every decision was filtered through one question: will this help him? When he talked about college, I nodded, even though I had no idea how I would afford it. When he mentioned opportunities in bigger cities, I smiled while calculating what I could sell, what I could give up. I learned to say yes before I even understood the cost, and somehow I always found a way. I remember the day he left for school, standing on the porch with that old oak tree watching over us. He hugged me quickly, awkwardly, like boys do when they don't quite know how to express gratitude. I stood there long after his car disappeared down the street, telling myself that this was what success looked like, that letting go was part of loving. When he came back years later, degree in hand and confidence in his step, I felt something close to pride I can't properly describe. It wasn't loud, it wasn't boastful. It was quiet, deep, and steady, like knowing the long nights and empty sacrifices hadn't been wasted. He moved back into the house then. "Just for a little while," he said, "until I get settled." Of course, I said yes. I rearranged my routines again, made space in the fridge, gave up the guest room, adjusted without thinking. Mothers do that, especially mothers who have been alone for a long time. At first, it felt good to have him there. The house felt alive again. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, noise that reminded me I wasn't alone. I told myself this was the reward, that this was what family looked like after everything we'd been through. The house, in my mind, was still sacred, still a symbol of endurance, still something I had built with purpose. I thought my son saw it the same way, as a place of safety, not ownership. I trusted him. That trust came from years of believing that love, if given enough, teaches respect automatically. I was wrong about that, but at the time, I didn't see it. I didn't notice how often he spoke about the house as if it were already his future asset, how casually he referred to renovations and plans that didn't include me, how conversations shifted from gratitude to expectation. I brushed it off. He's just thinking ahead, I told myself. He's ambitious. He's confident. I wanted to believe that my sacrifices had raised a man who understood value, not just of money, but of effort, of history, of people. That belief was comforting. It allowed me to keep giving without questioning, to keep stepping aside quietly, to keep thinking that one day when everything was said and done, he would look back and understand what it took to build the life he inherited. The house became more than walls to me. It was memory, layered upon memory. My husband's laughter echoing in the living room. My son learning to walk across the same floor he now paced as an adult. Late nights of sewing at the kitchen table, fingers aching, lights burning long past midnight. Every inch of that home held a version of me I had given away. And still, I never once thought of protecting it from my own child. That idea would have felt like betrayal, because in my heart, the house was never leverage, never power, never control. It was love made visible, and love, I believed then, didn't need boundaries. That's when fear entered my own home. I can't pinpoint the exact day it began, only the moment I realized something had changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, wrapped in ordinary conversation, disguised as confidence. One evening, we were sitting at the dinner table. Nothing special. Leftover chicken. A dim yellow light hanging low over us, casting long shadows across the wood. I remember thinking how tired I was, the kind of tired that settles into your bones and never quite leaves. My son leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. Not the way you look at a place you live in, but the way you look at something you're assessing. "This house has good bones," he said casually. "If you update the kitchen, it'll be worth a lot more." I nodded, absent-mindedly. Then he added, "I mean, it's my house too." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I laughed softly, thinking it was a joke. "No," I said gently. "It's still mine." He smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, just enough to let me know he didn't agree. "Well," he said, shrugging, "for now." That was the first time I felt it. A flicker of unease, a small tightening in my chest. I told myself I was overthinking, that he didn't mean anything by it, that young people talk differently these days, but the feeling didn't leave. It stayed. Over time, the comments became more frequent, more confident, less disguised. He spoke about the house as if it were already his responsibility, his future, his asset. He criticized how I kept things, why I didn't modernize, why I held on to old furniture, old habits, old memories. "You don't need all this space," he said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of my bedroom. "It's too much for one person." I looked up from folding laundry. "I've lived here longer than you have," I replied. He chuckled. "Yeah, but things change." That word again. Change. I noticed how he started answering questions directed at me, how he spoke over me when neighbors stopped by, how he corrected me in my own home, as if I were a guest who didn't understand how things worked anymore. I stopped inviting friends over, not because he told me to, but because his presence made everything feel tense. Conversations felt monitored, laughter felt inappropriate. I found myself cleaning more, apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. And still I told myself it was temporary. That stress from work was getting to him, that adulthood was heavy, that sons sometimes forget their tone with their mothers. But then came the night that changed how I felt about my own kitchen. We were eating quietly. He scrolled through his phone, barely touching his food. I mentioned the utility bill, how it had gone up again. "You should let me handle that," he said without looking up. "I've handled it for years," I replied. He set his phone down slowly. "That's the problem," he said. "You're still acting like this is just yours." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I live here. I contribute. I should have a say." A say. In my home, in my finances, in my life. Something inside me shifted. Not anger, not yet. Fear. Because the way he said it wasn't angry, it was assured. As if this conversation had already happened in his head, and I was simply late catching up. I realized then that he wasn't asking. He was informing me. That night, lying in bed, I listened to his footsteps moving through the house. The sound felt different than it used to. He wasn't just walking anymore, he was pacing, claiming, measuring, and for the first time since my husband died, the house didn't feel like a refuge. It felt watched. That's when fear entered my own home. After that night, nothing was openly said, but everything was felt. The house began to change, not in structure but in atmosphere. Conversations shortened, silences stretched. The air felt tight, as if one wrong word could snap something fragile and unrecoverable. My son started making decisions without asking. Small things at first. He moved items around in the kitchen, rearranged cabinets, replaced light bulbs I hadn't complained about. When I asked why, he shrugged. "It just makes more sense this way." I told myself not to be sensitive. But it wasn't the changes themselves. It was the assumption behind them. He began monitoring expenses, asking what I spent money on, why I needed certain things, whether something was necessary. His questions weren't curious, they were evaluative. "You don't really need that," he said one afternoon, glancing at a receipt on the counter. "We should start being smarter." That word slipped into his language quietly, then stayed. I noticed how often he positioned himself between me and others, answering questions meant for me, correcting my memories, rewriting stories I'd lived. When neighbors spoke about the house, he spoke as if he were already its steward. "Eventually, it'll all fall on me anyway," he said once, laughing. No one laughed with him. At night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. Doors opening, cabinets closing, footsteps moving with purpose. The familiarity I once found comforting now kept me alert. I started choosing my words carefully. Not because I feared conflict, but because I feared escalation. There was a difference. I stopped mentioning finances, stopped pushing back when he dismissed my opinions. I told myself that keeping the peace was better than provoking something I didn't yet understand. But peace built on silence is never stable. One evening, he confronted me in the living room. No yelling, no threats, just certainty. "You shouldn't make decisions about the house without telling me," he said. I looked at him. "Why would I need to?" "Because I live here," he replied. "Because this affects my future." I felt my throat tighten. "This is still my home," I said quietly. He tilted his head, studying me. "For now." The words landed heavier this time. I realized then that he wasn't waiting for inheritance. He was already acting as if it had happened. In his mind, ownership wasn't something to be earned or discussed. It was inevitable, and I was simply in the way. I began to feel smaller in my own space. I sat less in the living room, ate meals alone, retreated to my bedroom early, not out of weakness, but instinct. Survival has a way of teaching you when to conserve energy. Friends noticed my absence. Invitations went unanswered. I told myself I was tired, that I wanted quiet. But the truth was harder to admit. I didn't want anyone to see how tense things had become. I didn't want to explain something I didn't yet have words for. The control wasn't physical, not yet. But it was constant. A tone, a look, a pause before I spoke. I found myself asking permission without realizing it, explaining purchases, justifying routines I'd had for decades. I hated that feeling, but I hated confrontation more. One night, as I washed dishes, he stood in the doorway watching me. "You should really think about downsizing someday," he said. "This place is too much for you." I turned off the faucet. "I'm not ready to leave." He smiled again. That same smile, the one that didn't ask. "You won't have to decide forever," he said. I understood then that his patience wasn't kindness, it was strategy. And for the first time since I had raised my son alone, since I had carried the weight of everything without complaint, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not sadness, not anger, fear. Fear of being erased slowly, fear of becoming invisible in my own life, fear that the love I gave freely had been mistaken for surrender. That was when I knew the problem wasn't disagreement, it was entitlement, and entitlement, once it takes root, doesn't stop growing on its own. I didn't change my will out of anger. The night I finally understood what was happening, I didn't cry. That surprised me. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow rhythm of the house settling around me. The familiar creaks, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of my son moving through rooms that had once felt like mine alone. And instead of fear, something else rose to the surface. Clarity. It wasn't sudden. It didn't strike like lightning. It came quietly, piece by piece, as if my mind had finally stopped arguing with what my body already knew. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't miscommunication. This was entitlement. And entitlement, left unchallenged, only grows. I realized then that waiting for things to get better wasn't patience. It was denial. I had spent years believing that love could correct behavior, that silence could preserve peace, that sacrifice would eventually be recognized. But love without boundaries doesn't teach respect. It teaches access. The next morning I woke up early, before my son, before the house fully stirred. The light outside was pale and gray, matching the calm resolve settling in my chest. I made coffee, drank it standing at the counter, and made a decision I had avoided for far too long. I needed protection. Not from a stranger, not from the world, from my own child. That truth hurt more than I expected, but it didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. I didn't confront him. I didn't warn him. I didn't explain myself. I understood something important then. The moment you announce your boundaries to someone who benefits from crossing them, you give them time to resist. So I stayed quiet. 2 days later, I called a lawyer. My hands didn't shake when I dialed the number. My voice didn't waver when I introduced myself. I told the receptionist I needed to review my estate planning documents and make changes. She didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. The law office was small and quiet, tucked into a building I had driven past 100 times without ever imagining I would need it. When I walked inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The waiting room was empty, no television, no noise, just stillness. I liked that. The lawyer who met with me was calm, professional, and uncurious in the best way. He didn't ask emotional questions. He didn't assume my reasons. He spoke in facts, options, protections. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not as a mother, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with rights. We went through my existing will slowly. Every clause, every assumption, every unspoken expectation. I realized how outdated it was, written at a time when I believed love alone would guide the future, when I assumed my intentions were obvious and permanent. They weren't. I told him what I wanted: clarity, boundaries, accountability. I wanted the house protected. I wanted conditions. I wanted oversight. I wanted to make sure that no one, no matter their relationship to me, could claim what wasn't freely given. The lawyer nodded, took notes, and asked precise questions. Questions that didn't accuse or judge, but revealed just how vulnerable I had been. As I answered them, something inside me steadied. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't anger. This was self-respect. When the paperwork was ready, he slid the documents across the desk toward me. The pen lay on top, waiting. For a brief moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted my decision, but because I was grieving the version of motherhood that believed protection only flowed one way. Then I signed. My name looked firm on the page, unapologetic. As I handed the documents back, I felt something lift from my chest, a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. I walked out of that office without calling anyone, without explaining anything, without rehearsing conversations that might never happen. For the first time, I had acted purely for myself, quietly, legally, irreversibly. When I returned home that afternoon, the house looked the same. The porch still creaked, the oak tree still cast its familiar shadow across the lawn. The windows reflected a life that appeared unchanged from the outside. But I wasn't the same woman who had left that morning. I placed my keys on the counter and stood still for a moment, listening. The house breathed around me, unaware of the shift that had already taken place. Somewhere down the hall, my son's door was closed. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. I had learned something important in that quiet law office. Protection doesn't require permission. From that day forward, I moved differently, not dramatically, not defiantly, just deliberately. I kept my routine, cooked meals, paid bills, folded laundry. I answered questions the same way I always had, but with fewer words. Where I once explained myself, I now paused. Where I once justified, I now listened. Silence became a boundary. My son noticed the change, though he couldn't name it. He asked more questions, watched me more closely. There was a restlessness in him, as if he sensed that something had shifted beneath his feet. "You've been quiet," he said one evening. "I've always been quiet," I replied. It was true, but not in the way he meant. Inside, I felt steadier than I had in years. The constant tension in my chest had eased, not because the situation had improved, but because I had stopped hoping it would fix itself. Hope, I realized, had kept me vulnerable. Preparation made me calm. I organized my documents that night, not just the will, everything, deeds, accounts, insurance papers. I labeled folders carefully, stacking them neatly in a drawer only I could access. The act itself was grounding, methodical, protective. I wasn't hiding anything. I was claiming clarity. There was grief in that process, too. I won't deny it. Each document felt like a quiet acknowledgement that the future I once imagined, the uncomplicated passing of everything from mother to son, no longer existed. But grief doesn't mean regret. It means understanding. I thought about all the times I had confused love with exposure. How often I had assumed that because someone was family, they would treat me gently by default. I understood now that trust without structure invites imbalance, and imbalance, left unchecked, becomes harm. I didn't tell anyone about the changes I'd made, not friends, not relatives, not even myself, out loud. The decision didn't need witnesses, it only needed to stand. In the days that followed, my son continued to talk about the future as if it were still his to manage. Renovations, selling one day. What made sense financially? I listened. And I let him talk, because there was power in knowing something he didn't. Not the power to hurt him, but the power to remain unmoved by his assumptions. I realized then that I didn't need to convince him of anything. Reality would do that for me. At night, when the house grew quiet, I sat alone in the living room and allowed myself to feel what I had been avoiding: the sadness, the disappointment, the loss of an innocence I hadn't known I was still carrying. But beneath it all, there was relief, deep, steady relief. I had drawn a line, not with confrontation, but with law, not with anger, but with foresight. I had chosen to protect myself without asking anyone else to change. That choice didn't make me cold, it made me safe. I slept better after that, woke without dread. The fear that had crept into my home no longer controlled my thoughts. It was still there, hovering, but it no longer dictated my next move. Because now I had one. I understood something I wish I had learned sooner. Boundaries don't destroy families. Entitlement does. And when the truth finally surfaced, when the papers were read, when the assumptions collapsed, I would not have to raise my voice or defend my character. The work had already been done. Quietly, legally, with intention. I didn't change my will out of anger. I changed it because I finally understood what it meant to survive, not just the loss of a husband, but the slow erosion of safety that can happen when love goes unguarded. And once you understand that, you stop waiting, you prepare. I knew this would change everything. The table was set more neatly than usual. That was the first sign. Plates aligned, silverware straightened, the tablecloth pressed flat, every crease smoothed out as if order itself could hold the day together. I had cooked slowly, carefully, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because routine was the only thing that steadied my hands. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before. Every second felt deliberate. My son sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. The kind of ease that comes from believing you are still in control. He didn't know what I knew, and that knowledge sat between us like a weight neither of us acknowledged. I watched him eat. Watched how comfortable he was in that chair. How natural it felt to him to take up space at that table, in that house, in decisions that were never formally his. He spoke casually about work, about plans, about the future, as if it were already mapped out in his favor. I nodded where expected, responded when necessary. Inside, I waited. I hadn't planned to bring it up that day. At least, that's what I told myself. But some truths don't stay buried once they've been prepared. They surface on their own terms, especially when silence begins to feel dishonest. Halfway through the meal, he looked up suddenly. "So," he said, wiping his mouth, "I was thinking about the house again." There it was. Not a question. A statement. I set my fork down carefully. "What about it?" He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing loosely. "We should probably start talking about what happens next. You know, long term." My pulse stayed steady. "We've talked about that before," I said. "Not really," he replied. "Not seriously." He glanced toward the clock, then back at me. "I just think it's better to be clear." Clear. The word echoed in my mind. I realized then that this conversation was inevitable, that the careful preparation, the quiet organizing, the legal safeguards, all of it had been leading to this moment of suspended truth. I took a breath. "There are things you don't know," I said slowly. He frowned. "Like what?" I looked down at my plate, then back up at him. "Like the fact that assumptions aren't plans." He laughed lightly. "Mom, don't make this complicated." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply let the silence stretch long enough for him to notice it. The ticking clock filled the space between us. "I've taken care of things," I said at last. His smile faded just slightly. "Taken care of what things?" I folded my hands in front of me, the way I had so many mornings before. "My affairs." The word seemed to land heavier than I expected. He sat forward now. "You mean the will?" I didn't answer immediately. That pause was intentional. "Yes," I said. The air changed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode, but something tightened, like a wire pulled too far. He didn't speak right away. His eyes searched my face, scanning for reassurance I wasn't offering. "Okay," he said finally. "And?" "And it's finalized," I replied. He blinked. "Finalized how?" I could hear the shift in his voice now, the edge creeping in, the impatience, the expectation that clarity would arrive in his favor, as it always had. "I made changes," I said. He stared at me. "Without talking to me?" "Yes." That was the moment the room truly went quiet. The clock ticked. The house hummed. The future hovered, uncertain. He pushed his chair back slightly. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "Why would you do that now?" I met his gaze. Because now is when it needed to be done. He shook his head, almost amused. You're being dramatic. I didn't respond. Because this wasn't drama, this was disclosure. And I knew, deep in my chest, where instinct lives, that once those words had been spoken, there was no returning to the comfort of unspoken assumptions. I knew this would change everything. He didn't raise his voice. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back again, as if reclaiming ground he felt was slipping. You know I should have been part of that conversation, he said. His tone was measured, almost reasonable. We live together. This affects me. I studied him carefully. The controlled posture, the practiced calm. This wasn't concern. It was calculation. The kind that appears when someone realizes certainty is no longer guaranteed. I've always handled my affairs, I replied. That hasn't changed. He exhaled through his nose, a thin smile returning. Come on, you're acting like I'm some outsider. I didn't answer. Silence, I had learned, forces people to reveal more than questions ever do. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. So, what did you change? He asked. Details matter. They do, I said. Which is why I was careful. His eyes narrowed. Careful how? I folded my hands, steady, careful to make things clear. That doesn't tell me anything, he snapped. I met his gaze. It tells you enough. The clock ticked. He glanced at it, then back at me, impatience breaking through the thin layer of restraint. You can't just decide these things without considering the consequences. I did consider them, I said quietly. That's why I acted. He laughed, sharper this time. You're letting fear make decisions. I shook my head. No. I'm letting reality inform them. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stood and began pacing the length of the room, footsteps measured, deliberate. Each pass felt like pressure, an unspoken attempt to dominate the space. So who else is involved? He asked, stopping near the doorway. Because it sounds like you've been influenced. I recognized the tactic immediately. If the decision couldn't be his, it had to be someone else's fault. No one influenced me, I said. I made my choices. He scoffed. That's hard to believe. I kept my voice even. It shouldn't be. He turned back to the table, hands braced against the wood. I've given up things to be here, he said. I've helped out. I've contributed. I acknowledge that, I replied, and it doesn't entitle you to control. The word landed. Entitle. His jaw tightened. So you don't trust me? I trust myself, I said. The room seemed to shrink around us. He straightened, anger flickering in his eyes now, no longer disguised. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Then it will stand on its own, I answered. He stared at me, searching for cracks, for hesitation, for guilt he could leverage. He found none. Tell me exactly what you changed, he demanded. I rose slowly and began clearing the table, lifting plates, stacking them neatly. Not as an escape, an assertion. I would not sit beneath his interrogation. I made arrangements, I said, carrying dishes to the sink. I set conditions. I ensured oversight. He followed me into the kitchen. Oversight from who? I turned, meeting his eyes. Professionals. The word seemed to ignite something in him. You went to a lawyer. Yes. You didn't think to talk to me first? I didn't need to. He stepped closer, invading my space. I didn't retreat. I simply held my ground. This is my life, I said, my home, my decisions. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his voice dropped. You're making a mistake. I nodded once. I've made many mistakes. This isn't one of them. He turned away abruptly, running a hand through his hair. The confidence he'd carried into the conversation was gone now, replaced by agitation. You're going to regret this, he muttered. I watched him pace again, the house absorbing the tension like a held breath. I'm done discussing this tonight, I said. He stopped short. We're not finished. We are, I replied. For now. That phrase, for now, had once been his. Hearing it from my mouth changed the balance in the room. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, as if realizing something fundamental had shifted. He left the kitchen without another word, footsteps heavy on the floor. I stood at the sink, hands resting on the counter, listening to the clock resume its steady rhythm. The truth had been spoken, not fully, not all at once, but enough to fracture assumptions that had stood unchallenged for years. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. I knew the real confrontation was still ahead, that documents and facts would soon replace speculation and pressure. But tonight had served its purpose. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was anticipation. And I understood then that once truth is introduced, it doesn't retreat. It waits, patiently, for the moment it's required to speak louder. He wasn't angry about love. He was angry about control. The shift was immediate. The moment he realized I wasn't going to bend, something in him broke loose. Not loudly at first, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with a tension so sharp it felt like the air itself had turned brittle. He stood up so suddenly, his chair scraped violently against the floor. The sound echoed through the room, louder than it should have been, slicing through the silence we had both been holding. I didn't move. I stayed seated, my hands resting calmly on the table, my back straight. Not because I felt brave, but because I knew that reacting would only give his anger somewhere to land. "This is unbelievable," he said, pacing now, his voice tight. "After everything I've done for you." I watched him carefully. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me, at the house, the space, the walls. "What exactly have you done?" I asked quietly. He stopped short and turned toward me, eyes flashing. "I gave up my life to be here," he snapped. "I could have lived anywhere. I stayed. I helped. I supported you." His words came faster now, piling on top of each other, each accusation heavier than the last. He spoke of sacrifices I had never asked him to make, of obligations I had never imposed, of debts he believed were owed simply because he existed in my space. I recognized it immediately. Not gratitude, not concern. Entitlement. "You act like I'm some kind of threat," he continued, "like I don't belong here." I met his gaze. Belonging isn't the same as owning. That was when his composure cracked. He slammed his hand on the table, not hard enough to be violence, but hard enough to be a warning. Plates rattled. The silverware clinked together in a sharp, nervous chorus. "This is my house, too," he said. "I live here. I contribute. I have a say." The words spilled out of him now, unfiltered, unchecked. Years of assumption poured into the room all at once. I felt something settle inside me, not fear, but clarity. "You live here," I said evenly. "You don't own it." His jaw clenched. "That's not how it works." "That's exactly how it works," I replied. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're being ridiculous," he said. "You wouldn't even have this place if it weren't for me sticking around." The statement stunned me, not because it was true, but because of how easily it left his mouth, how confidently he rewrote history to suit his narrative. I realized then that this wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about dominance. He stepped closer to the table, leaning forward, his shadow stretching across the surface between us. "You're trying to cut me out," he accused. "After everything I've invested." "Your investment doesn't give you control," I said. He scoffed. "You think a piece of paper can protect you?" I didn't answer. My silence infuriated him more than any argument could have. He needed reaction, validation, resistance, something to push against. Instead, I remained still. He ran a hand through his hair, breathing hard now. "You're making me the villain," he said. "You're acting like I'm abusing you." I looked up at him then. Really looked at him. "You're angry," I said, "but not because I hurt you." His eyes narrowed. "Then why?" "Because you're losing control." The words hung in the air, undeniable. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, laugh it off, deflect. But instead, his face darkened, and the truth surfaced without disguise. "I should have a say in what happens to this house," he said slowly. "I should have security." "You want ownership," I corrected gently. not security. That distinction pushed him over the edge. He turned away sharply, knocking his chair further aside, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. The room felt smaller now, charged with the kind of energy that makes you instinctively prepare to protect yourself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I didn't threaten. I stayed exactly where I was. Because in that moment, I understood something essential. He wasn't angry about love. He wasn't angry about family. He was angry because the power he assumed was slipping away. And once that kind of entitlement is exposed, it can't be put back in the shadows. After that, his anger stopped pretending to be reasonable. He began circling the room, footsteps heavy, uneven. Each step felt like a challenge, an attempt to reclaim authority through presence alone. He talked louder now, not shouting, but filling the space, crowding it, making sure there was no room for anything but him. "You think you can just shut me out?" he said, "like I don't matter?" I stayed seated. Not frozen, not defeated, grounded. "I think you're confusing being heard with being obeyed," I replied. That did it. He stopped abruptly and turned on me, eyes sharp, voice dropping to something colder. "You're doing this on purpose," he said. "You want me to lose." I shook my head slowly. "This isn't a competition." He laughed again, short, harsh. "Everything is." There it was, not concern for me, not fear of loss, competition. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the familiar soap he used, close enough that the imbalance was unmistakable. The table between us felt suddenly very small. "You don't get to decide everything," he said. "You're not thinking clearly." I recognized the move immediately. Question the judgment, undermine the authority, reframe resistance as instability. "I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years," I said. He scoffed. "That's what people say when they've been manipulated." "By who?" I asked. He hesitated. That pause told me everything. He didn't have an answer because the problem wasn't influence, it was independence, and independence terrifies people who rely on access to control. "You owe me," he said suddenly. "After everything." The word owe landed with a dull thud. I felt a sadness then, not sharp, not overwhelming, just heavy, because I realized he wasn't talking about care or connection. He was talking about leverage. "I owe you honesty," I said. "I don't owe you ownership." His face tightened. "You're choosing paper over blood." "No," I replied. "I'm choosing boundaries over fear." For a moment, the room went very quiet. Not the calm kind, an alert quiet. The kind that tells you something irreversible is hovering just beneath the surface. He knocked the chair aside as he turned away, the sound loud and abrupt. "You're making a mistake," he said again. But this time there was something else in his voice. Not warning, resentment. "You think this will end well?" he continued. "You think people won't judge you for this?" I didn't answer. Because I had learned that when someone starts threatening your reputation, they've already lost the moral ground. "I could make things very uncomfortable," he added, glancing back at me. I looked at him steadily. "I'm already uncomfortable," I said. "That's why I changed things." The words seemed to drain the energy from him all at once. His shoulders slumped slightly, then squared again, as if he were deciding which version of himself to use next. He tried another angle. "You're scared," he said softly. "That's all this is." I nodded once. "Yes, I am." He looked surprised. "I'm scared of losing myself," I continued, "and I won't let that happen." That honesty seemed to unsettle him more than resistance ever could. He turned away and paced again, muttering under his breath. I caught fragments, complaints, justifications, revisions of history that placed him firmly at the center and me on the periphery. I watched him, quietly cataloging what I was seeing. Not a son afraid of losing connection, a man afraid of losing control. Eventually, he stopped moving. "We're not done with this," he said flatly. I met his gaze. "I know." He left the room without another word, footsteps heavy as he disappeared down the hall. A door closed. harder than necessary. I stayed where I was long after he was gone. My hands trembled slightly now, the adrenaline finally catching up. I didn't shame myself for it. Fear is a signal, not a failure. I breathed, slowly, deliberately. I understood then that whatever line had once existed between us, whatever assumptions had kept things manageable, was gone. This wasn't about disagreement anymore. It was about safety. And as I sat there in the quiet aftermath, I knew with absolute certainty that the next step wouldn't be conversation. It would be consequence. I didn't argue. The law spoke for me. The morning felt unusually still, not peaceful, just suspended, as if the house itself was holding its breath, aware that something decisive was about to happen. I woke early, as I had for weeks, but this time there was no knot in my chest, no rehearsed conversations running through my mind. The decision had already been made. The work had already been done. All that remained was truth. I set the table carefully, not elaborately, just neatly. Plates aligned, coffee poured. The same kitchen where fear had once crept in now felt different. Not reclaimed yet, but steady, anchored. My son sat across from me, unusually quiet. He had sensed the shift since the night before. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder, watchful. "You're being strange," he said finally. I looked up. "I'm being precise." He frowned. "About what?" Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door, sharp, professional, unmistakable. I stood without rushing. My son stiffened. "Who is that?" "I told you," I said calmly, "that I handled my affairs." I opened the door to a man in a neutral suit, a briefcase held close to his side. Behind him stood a second figure, quiet, observant, a witness, not confrontational, not emotional, just present. "Good morning," the lawyer said. "May we come in?" I stepped aside. My son stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "What is this?" he demanded. "This," I said, "is clarity." We returned to the table. The lawyer didn't sit immediately. He placed the briefcase down first, deliberately, then opened it. The sound of clasps clicking open was loud in the stillness. He removed a stack of documents and laid them out on the table, straightening the edges, aligning the pages with care. I noticed my son's eyes tracking every movement. "These documents," the lawyer began, voice even, "reflect the current legal standing of the property and estate." My son laughed once, sharply. "You can't be serious." The lawyer didn't look at him. He looked at me. "With your permission," he said. I nodded. He turned the top page over, revealing the title deed. Names, dates, signatures, clear, unambiguous. "The property," he continued, "is solely owned by her." My son leaned forward, scanning the page. His jaw tightened. "That's temporary," he said. "Things change." "They can," the lawyer replied calmly, "but only through lawful processes. This documentation confirms sole ownership." Silence followed. The lawyer proceeded without pause, laying out the next document. "The will has been revised," he said. "Finalized, witnessed, filed." My son looked up at me sharply. "You did this behind my back." "I did this," I said evenly, "to protect myself." He turned back to the lawyer. "She can't just decide this alone." "She can," the lawyer replied. And she did. The words landed softly, but they landed. The lawyer explained the conditions, the safeguards, the oversight. Each clause presented not as accusation but as fact, the kind of fact that doesn't ask for agreement. My son's confidence drained slowly, visibly. He searched the pages for loopholes, for ambiguity, for anything he could challenge. There was none. "What about my contributions?" he snapped. "I lived here. I helped." "Living in a home," the lawyer said gently, "does not confer ownership." I watched my son sit back, stunned. This wasn't the confrontation he had prepared for. There were no raised voices to overpower, no emotions to manipulate, no guilt to weaponize, just paper, just law, just truth. I didn't argue, I thought. I didn't need to. The lawyer closed the folder and looked up. Do you have any questions? My son opened his mouth, closed it, then asked quietly, So what happens now? The lawyer turned to me. I met my son's gaze. Now, I said, things are exactly as they should be. He stared at me, searching for anger, for triumph. He found neither. Because this wasn't revenge, it was resolution. And as the documents lay there between us, solid, final, I felt something settle deep inside me. The fear that had once haunted my own home no longer had authority here. The law had spoken, quietly, decisively, without asking permission. The room stayed quiet after the lawyer finished speaking. Not the tense quiet from before. This one was different. It had weight, finality, the kind of silence that follows a verdict no one expected to hear. My son sat motionless, eyes fixed on the documents spread across the table. His hands, which had been restless all morning, now lay still in his lap. The confidence he had carried for so long seemed to drain out of him, leaving something hollow behind. This can't be right, he said finally, his voice low. There has to be something, some mistake. The lawyer didn't rush to answer. He simply slid one page closer, tapping a signature. Everything here has been reviewed, he said. Witnessed, filed. There is no ambiguity. My son swallowed. He looked at me then, not with anger this time, but disbelief, as if he were seeing a version of me he hadn't prepared for. Not the accommodating mother, not the woman who explained herself, but someone grounded, immovable. You planned this, he said. I shook my head slowly. I prepared. There was a difference. The lawyer gathered the documents into neat stacks again, his movements calm, practiced. He explained the next steps, what would happen, what wouldn't, what rights existed, what claims did not. Each sentence closed another door my son had assumed would always be open. So that's it? He asked. I have no say? You have a relationship, I said quietly, not ownership. The witness remained silent throughout, her presence steady and unremarkable. And yet, it mattered, because nothing about this moment depended on emotion or interpretation. It depended on record. My son leaned back slowly, chair creaking beneath him. For the first time since this all began, he didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He had run out of leverage. What happens if I don't agree? He asked. The lawyer met his gaze. Agreement isn't required. The words landed gently, but they landed. I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication, just a deep, steady calm. The kind that comes when uncertainty finally releases its grip. I realized then that justice doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork. The lawyer closed his briefcase. If there are no further questions, we'll conclude here. My son stared at the table, then nodded once. Fine, he said, though nothing about it felt fine. The lawyer turned to me. You've done the right thing, he said softly. I didn't respond, not because I disagreed, but because I didn't need affirmation. The choice had already proven itself. They stood to leave. The witness followed. The door closed behind them with a quiet, ordinary sound. And just like that, it was over. My son remained seated long after they were gone. The house felt different now, lighter, steadier. The tension that had lived in the walls seemed to dissipate, as if it had been waiting for permission to leave. You didn't have to do it this way, he said at last. I looked at him. I did. He shook his head. You embarrassed me. I protected myself, I replied. He stood slowly, pushing his chair back without the anger from before. You've changed, he said. Yes, I said. I have. There was nothing else to add. He left the room quietly this time, footsteps measured, subdued. I heard a door close down the hall, not slammed, just closed. I stayed at the table, hands resting where the documents had been moments earlier. The wood felt cool beneath my fingers, solid. For the first time in months, I felt safe in my own home, not because the situation had become easy, but because it had become clear. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I didn't plead. I let the law speak for me. And when it did, it said exactly what needed to be said without raising its voice. He left the house 2 days later. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a suitcase placed carefully by the entryway, like he was afraid to make noise. I watched from the hallway as he zipped it shut, his movements stiff, unfamiliar. For years, I had imagined this moment in fear. I thought his leaving would break me. Instead, it felt quiet. He didn't look back when he stepped outside. The door closed with a soft click, and for a long moment, I stood there listening, waiting for something. Anger, relief, guilt. What came was none of those. Just air. The house breathed for the first time in years. That afternoon I called a locksmith. Not because I was afraid he would return that night, but because I needed to mark the end of something. The man arrived with a small toolbox and a polite smile. He worked efficiently, unsentimental, replacing old locks with new ones that gleamed softly in the daylight. When he handed me the new keys, they felt heavier than they should have. Not with fear, with ownership. That night I slept without checking the hallway, without listening for footsteps, without bracing myself for the sound of a door opening too hard. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was safe. In the days that followed, grief arrived, not as a wave, but as a slow ache. It settled in during quiet moments, when I poured 1 cup of coffee instead of 2, when I folded laundry and realized half of it was no longer needed. I missed the idea of my son, not the man he had become, but the child he once was, the boy who used to run into this house with scraped knees and laughter. Letting go of him felt like mourning someone who had already disappeared long ago. I didn't rush myself through it. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing what hurt. I scheduled my first therapy appointment on a Wednesday morning. Walking into that office felt harder than calling a lawyer ever had. Legal decisions are tidy, emotional ones are not. I sat across from a woman who didn't interrupt me, didn't rush me, didn't tell me what I should have done differently. She just listened, and when I finally said, "I think I disappeared in my own life," she nodded as if it made perfect sense. Because it did. Therapy didn't give me answers, it gave me language. For boundaries, for exhaustion, for the quiet damage that happens when love turns into obligation. Between sessions, I reorganized the house. Not dramatically, not symbolically. I moved furniture inch by inch until the rooms felt like mine again. I boxed up things I had kept out of guilt. I donated clothes I had stopped wearing because they made him uncomfortable. Every small choice was a reclaiming. I met with my lawyer one last time to finalize the will. Clear, unambiguous, calm. No justifications, no apologies written between the lines. Just facts, protections, and instructions that honored the life I had lived. When I signed it, my hand didn't shake. I wasn't angry. I was precise. Some evenings, loneliness sat beside me on the couch. I didn't push it away. I let it exist without letting it decide my future. I learned that being alone wasn't the same as being unsafe, and it certainly wasn't the same as being unloved. Friends came by with quiet understanding. No one asked for details. No one demanded explanations. They brought soup, laughter, and normal conversation, the kind that doesn't orbit around pain. Slowly, the house adjusted to me. Or maybe I adjusted to it. The sunlight in the mornings felt warmer. The living room seemed larger without tension curling in the corners. I started opening windows again, letting air move freely through rooms that had once felt closed in. Peace didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived quietly. Healing didn't arrive as a revelation. It came as routine. I began waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because my body finally rested. Mornings stopped feeling like something to survive. I made coffee slowly, standing by the window, watching the neighborhood wake up without tension tightening my chest. Some days were heavier than others. Grief doesn't disappear just because danger leaves. It lingers in quieter ways, when I passed his old room and hesitated, when I reached for my phone out of habit and then put it down again. I learned to let those moments pass without chasing them. In therapy, I talked about guilt, about the kind that doesn't shout but whispers, "Was I too harsh? Did I wait too long? Did I fail as a mother?" My therapist never answered those questions directly. She asked different ones. Who benefited from your silence? Who paid the price for your patience? Those questions stayed with me longer than any reassurance could. I started walking in the evenings. Nothing dramatic, just a loop around the block. At first I walked fast, as if trying to outrun something. Eventually, my pace slowed. I noticed gardens, the sound of children playing 2 streets over, the way the sky softened just before dusk. I realized I had been living in my own home for years without truly occupying it. That changed. I began cooking meals for myself, simple ones, not out of obligation, not to please anyone. I ate when I was hungry. I stopped apologizing to empty rooms for taking up space. One afternoon I stood in the kitchen and laughed at something small, burnt toast, maybe. The sound startled me. It had been so long since laughter felt natural, unguarded. Loneliness still visited, but it no longer had teeth. It sat beside me like an old acquaintance, not an enemy. I learned the difference between missing someone and missing who I used to be when I bent myself into someone else's shape. I also learned something harder, that forgiveness is not a prerequisite for peace. People often talk about forgiveness as if it's the finish line, as if healing can't exist without it. But what I learned, slowly, gently, is that safety comes first. Clarity comes next. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, must arrive on its own terms. I wasn't in a hurry. I changed my emergency contacts, updated paperwork, simplified things that had once felt overwhelming because I was carrying them alone and carrying someone else's chaos. I began to trust my own decisions again. That trust felt fragile at first, like a muscle unused for too long. But with each small choice, what to wear, where to go, when to rest, it strengthened. The house adapted to my new rhythm. Rooms that once held tension now held light. I repainted a wall I had always wanted to change but never did because it wasn't necessary. I rearranged bookshelves. I put photographs back on display, not to prove anything, not to preserve a narrative, but because they were part of my life, and my life deserved to be seen. Some nights were quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. I would sit on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the clock tick. No footsteps, no arguments waiting around corners, just time moving forward. I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact, and that mattered more. I stopped explaining my choices to people who hadn't lived my life. I learned that privacy is not secrecy, it's self-respect. Not everyone needs the details. Not everyone earns the truth. Most importantly, I stopped asking myself when things would feel normal again. This was the new normal, and it was enough. Peace didn't mean happiness every day. It didn't mean certainty. It didn't mean closure in a neat cinematic sense. Peace meant waking up without fear. And that was something I had earned. The first morning I stepped onto the porch without checking my phone, I knew something had changed. The sky was pale, still undecided between night and day. The air carried that cool, early quiet that belongs only to people who are not in a hurry. I stood there holding my coffee, listening to birds argue gently in the oak tree, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone's reaction. No approval, no permission, no explanation rehearsed in my head, just me, standing in my own space. For so long my life had felt like it was constantly being evaluated, by my son, by family, by the invisible standards I had absorbed over decades. Every decision came with a silent question. Will this upset someone? Will this be misunderstood? Will I have to defend myself? That morning, the questions were gone. I realized I had spent years believing that being a good mother meant staying available, flexible, and endlessly accommodating. That love required endurance, that saying no was a kind of failure. But what I had learned, slowly, painfully, is that love without boundaries isn't love. It's erasure. Choosing myself didn't feel rebellious. It felt overdue. like finally sitting down after standing for too long. My body recognized it before my mind did. Shoulders loosened. Breathing deepened. The constant low-level tension that had lived in me for years began to dissolve. I started making plans again, small ones, honest ones. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, not because I was good at it, but because I was curious. I planned a short trip to the coast with friends, something I'd postponed endlessly because it wasn't practical. I began to imagine a future that didn't revolve around managing someone else's emotions, and the world didn't collapse. No one punished me for it, no catastrophe followed. That realization was both liberating and unsettling. It meant I had been holding myself back long after I needed to. Some days the old reflexes tried to return, the urge to justify my choices, to soften my boundaries so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone. When that happened, I paused and reminded myself, my peace does not need to be reasonable to anyone else. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had done its job. It had protected me long enough to get out. What replaced it was something quieter and stronger: discernment. The ability to choose who and what belonged in my life without guilt. I thought about my son sometimes, not with longing, not with resentment, just awareness. I hoped he would continue healing. I hoped he would learn to live without leaning on someone else's sacrifice. But his journey was no longer mine to manage. That distinction between care and responsibility changed everything. Standing on the porch, watching the light shift, I understood that independence isn't loneliness, it's clarity. It's waking up knowing that your time, your energy, your safety are not negotiable. I hadn't chosen isolation. I had chosen alignment. The house behind me felt different now. Not heavy with memory, not haunted by tension. It felt like a place that belonged to a woman who had finally stopped shrinking herself to keep the peace. For the first time, my life wasn't under review. And I didn't miss the audience. As the sun lifted higher, the porch filled with light. It wasn't dramatic. No golden rays bursting through clouds. Just a steady brightness that made the world look ordinary and safe. I leaned against the railing, feeling the cool wood under my palms, and allowed myself to stay there longer than necessary. No schedule waited for me. For the first time in years, my day belonged entirely to me. Inside the house, the clock ticked softly. Not as a warning, not as pressure. Just time doing what time does, moving forward without judgment. I realized how often I had lived as if every moment needed justification. As if rest was something to earn. As if stillness meant failure. That belief didn't survive here. I started treating my life the way I treated my home now, with intention. I locked doors because I valued safety, not because I feared the world. I kept certain conversations private because they were mine, not because I was hiding anything. I said no without attaching an explanation, and nothing terrible happened. The people who respected me stayed. The ones who needed access to control me faded. That clarity felt like freedom. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't chase happiness. I simply stopped negotiating my dignity. I chose routines that supported my body. I chose silence when noise wasn't necessary. I chose peace even when it meant disappointment, for others. Sometimes I thought about how long it took me to get here. About all the moments I stayed quiet to keep things from escalating, all the ways I told myself this is just how families are. I don't regret loving deeply, but I do regret believing that love required me to disappear. That lesson came late, but it came, and it stayed. The porch became my favorite place: morning coffee, evening air, a place to sit with myself without needing distraction. Neighbors waved, the world passed by gently. I wasn't hiding anymore. But I wasn't performing either. I felt whole, not because everything was resolved, not because the past made sense, but because I finally belonged to myself. If there is one thing I understand now, it's this: choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop loving others. It means you stop sacrificing your safety to prove it. It means you stop waiting for permission to live the life you already earned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight. I didn't seek revenge. I simply chose to step into a life where fear no longer had a vote. For the first time, my life was no longer under review, and that was enough. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes sharing your thoughts helps someone else feel less alone. If you enjoy quiet stories about family, boundaries, and finding peace later in life, please consider subscribing. It truly helps this channel grow and reach the people who need it most. Thank you for listening, and for giving this story a place in your time.